Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Natchez, Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the summer of 1847, the elite families of Natchez took immense pride in possessing what visitors from New Orleans and Charleston described as the most refined choir of enslaved singers in the entire South. 32 voices, trained to perfection, performing at churches, balls, and social events with a precision and beauty that left audiences weeping. The man responsible for this excellence was Elijah Howe, a free person of color from Pennsylvania who had been hired in 1843 to instruct the enslaved workers of Natchez's most prominent families in the art of choral singing. What none of these wealthy patrons suspected was that for 4 years, hidden within the harmonies of Methodist hymns and sacred songs, Howe had been teaching his choir something entirely different, a coded language of freedom where every melody contained instructions for escape, every rhythm mapped routes north, and every rehearsal was preparation for the most meticulously orchestrated mass flight in Mississippi history. On the night of August 17, 1847, after performing a charity concert at First Presbyterian Church that received thunderous applause from Natchez's most distinguished citizens, all 32 members of the choir vanished. With them disappeared 17 children and 9 elderly relatives from surrounding plantations. 58 human beings simply evaporated into the humid Mississippi night. What makes this case particularly haunting is not just the scale of the disappearance, but what investigators discovered decades later about how freedom had been literally sung into existence, note by note, hymn by hymn, for 4 years under the noses of those who believed themselves masters. Natchez in the 1840s stood as one of the wealthiest cities in America, its prosperity built almost entirely on cotton and the labor of enslaved people. According to census records from the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, Adams County, which included Natchez, contained more millionaires per capita than any other county in the United States. The grand mansions overlooking the Mississippi River, with their columned facades and manicured gardens, represented the pinnacle of antebellum Southern wealth and culture. Within this culture, music held a particular significance. The wealthy families of Natchez prided themselves on their sophistication and refinement, qualities they demonstrated through elaborate social events, balls, and particularly through patronage of the arts. According to newspaper accounts from the Natchez Courier, musical entertainment featuring trained singers was considered essential for any event of importance. However, hiring professional musicians from northern cities was expensive and logistically difficult. The solution many wealthy families adopted was to train enslaved workers in musical performance. By the early 1840s, several Natchez families had developed informal arrangements where their most talented enslaved workers received basic musical instruction and performed at family gatherings. In 1843, according to minutes from the Natchez Musical Society discovered in 1958, a group of prominent citizens decided to formalize this arrangement by hiring a professional music instructor who could create a proper choir. The advertisement they placed in northern newspapers specified they sought a free person of color with musical training and impeccable references who would be willing to relocate to Mississippi to provide instruction. Elijah Howe responded to this advertisement with a letter, preserved in the papers of merchant Samuel Foster, one of the choir's primary patrons. The letter, written in an educated hand, described Howe as a 32-year-old music teacher from Philadelphia who had studied under Quaker instructors and had experience teaching vocal music to both white and colored students in Pennsylvania. He included testimonials from 3 Philadelphia ministers praising his character and abilities. What these testimonials did not reveal, and what would not be discovered until 1963, was that Elijah Howe was not from Philadelphia at all. According to research conducted by historian Dr. Marcus Williams, who examined fugitive slave advertisements and Underground Railroad records, Howe was almost certainly a man named Elijah who had escaped from a plantation in Loudoun County, Virginia, in 1839. The real Elijah Howe, a free black music teacher, had died in a cholera epidemic in 1841, and Elijah had assumed his identity, along with his credentials and letters of reference. The man calling himself Elijah Howe arrived in Natchez in September 1843 and immediately impressed his patrons with his professionalism and musical knowledge. According to a letter from Sarah Foster, Samuel's wife, to her sister in New Orleans dated October 1843, the new music teacher is quite remarkable. He speaks with refinement, displays extensive knowledge of musical theory, and has already begun organizing our servants into sections according to their vocal ranges. He seems entirely dedicated to his craft. Howe's arrangement with the Natchez Musical Society was documented in a contract preserved in Adams County legal records. He would be paid $40 per month, provided with lodging in a cottage near the foster residence, and given authority to select and instruct up to 35 enslaved individuals from participating families. The choir would rehearse 3 evenings per week and perform at designated social and religious events throughout the year. The selection process for choir members, according to testimony later provided by household staff, was conducted with unusual care. Howe visited each participating plantation personally, listening to dozens of workers sing before making his selections. Margaret Williams, a domestic servant who was not selected for the choir, testified in depositions taken in 1850 that Howe seemed to be evaluating something beyond just vocal ability. He would ask questions about families, about who had children, about whether workers could read. At the time, we thought he simply wanted intelligent singers. Only later did we understand he was selecting people for an entirely different purpose. The 32 individuals ultimately chosen for the choir represented a cross-section of the enslaved community in Natchez. According to plantation records examined by researchers in the 1960s, they included house servants and field workers, young adults and middle-aged individuals, men and women in roughly equal numbers. What they shared, beyond musical ability, was that nearly all had family connections to either very young children or elderly parents who would later be included in the escape. The choir began rehearsals in October 1843 in a large room above a warehouse owned by Samuel Foster, located near the Natchez riverfront. According to accounts in the Natchez Courier, which covered the choir's public performances, the group made rapid progress under Howe's instruction. By December 1843, they had given their first public performance at a Christmas charity event, singing a program of Methodist hymns and sacred songs that attendees described as remarkably polished for such a new ensemble. What the audience at that first performance did not know, and what would only be revealed through documents discovered more than a century later, was that the hymns being sung contained a second layer of meaning comprehensible only to those who had been taught to listen for it. The key to understanding Howe's method comes from a hymnal discovered in 1963 by Elijah Freeman, who identified herself as the daughter of 2 choir members. This manuscript hymnal, dated 1846 and written in Howe's hand, appeared at first glance to be a conventional collection of Methodist and Baptist hymns with standard musical notation. However, when researchers at Howard University examined the document, they discovered something extraordinary. Using techniques developed for analyzing historical documents, musicologist Dr. Helena Roberts found that certain pages of the hymnal contained writing in iron gall ink that had faded to near invisibility. When these pages were carefully heated, additional musical notation appeared, written between the lines of the conventional hymns. This hidden notation used a system unlike anything in European musical tradition. According to Dr. Roberts's analysis published in the Journal of American Musical History in 1968, the hidden notation appeared to be based on West African musical systems, particularly the talking drum traditions of Yoruba and Akan peoples. In these traditions, rhythmic patterns could convey complex messages by mimicking the tonal patterns of spoken language. Howe had adapted this concept to choral music, creating a system where specific melodic ornaments, rhythmic variations, and harmonic choices spelled out messages in a code that only those trained to hear it could comprehend. More remarkably, Dr. Roberts discovered that the sequence in which hymns were sung mattered. When she analyzed the programs from the choir's public performances, preserved in newspaper accounts and personal letters, she found that the order of hymns was never random. Each concert was carefully structured so that the hidden messages in successive hymns would combine to provide coherent information about routes, timing, and procedures for escape. A performance in March 1845, for instance, included 6 hymns sung in a specific order. According to Dr. Roberts's analysis, the hidden notation in these hymns, when decoded, provided instructions about seasonal river levels, the location of a safe house 30 miles north of Natchez, and a specific date when Underground Railroad conductors would be in the area. All of this information was embedded in music that sounded to white audiences like conventional sacred songs performed with exceptional artistry. The question that haunted later researchers was how Howe taught this system to choir members, most of whom could not read conventional musical notation, let alone a complex code. The answer appears to have been through oral tradition and repeated rehearsal. According to testimony provided in 1964 by Elijah Freeman, whose memories were based on stories told by her parents, Howe used the 3 times weekly rehearsals to drill the coded elements into the choir's collective memory. The official rehearsals, the ones that household staff and occasional white observers might witness, focused on perfecting the surface performance of hymns. But according to Grace's account, Howe also conducted unofficial rehearsals, meeting with smaller groups of choir members at different times and locations, during which he would explain the deeper meanings embedded in the music. He taught us that every song was 2 songs, Grace recalled her mother saying. One for the master's ears, one for our souls. The coded messages in the hymns covered an extraordinary range of practical information necessary for a mass escape. Some songs taught navigation techniques, with melodic patterns that mimicked the position of stars used for nighttime orientation. Others contained numerical codes, with specific musical intervals representing distances in miles or dates in the calendar. Still others taught recognition signals that would identify friendly contacts along the escape route. Perhaps most remarkably, according to Dr. Roberts's analysis, several hymns contained embedded maps. The musical contour of a melody, its rises and falls, would correspond to geographical features along the route north. A rising sequence of notes might indicate approaching hills. A pattern of repeated pitches could represent a long straight stretch of road. Harmonic changes could mark river crossings or changes in direction. All of this information had to be memorized perfectly because written materials would be impossible to carry during an escape attempt. The genius of Howe's system was that the information was hidden in plain sight, or rather, in plain sound. The choir could practice their escape plan openly, in front of audiences, even receiving applause for how well they executed what was secretly a rehearsal for flight. The scale of planning required for the eventual escape was extraordinary. According to documents discovered in Canadian archives in 1989, Howe had been in communication with underground railroad networks in Ohio and Pennsylvania since at least 1844. Letters preserved in the papers of abolitionist Levi Coffin reference a music teacher in Mississippi who was organizing what Coffin called an unprecedented movement of many souls together. These letters indicate that Howe had coordinated with multiple safehouses along a route through Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, and ultimately into Canada. The logistics alone were staggering. Moving 58 people, including children as young as 3 and elderly individuals in their 70s, across 1,000 miles through hostile territory required extraordinary preparation. According to analysis of the coded hymns by Dr. Roberts, Howe used the 4 years of rehearsal not just to teach escape routes but to physically condition choir members for the journey ahead. The rehearsal schedule gradually increased in duration and intensity, building endurance. Some of the coded songs contained instructions for what supplies to prepare and how to conceal them. The selection of August 17, 1847, as the escape date was no accident. According to meteorological records examined by researchers, the moon was dark that night, providing maximum concealment. The Mississippi River, a major geographical barrier, was low enough in August to be forded at several points. Most significantly, the date coincided with the annual camp meeting season, when large religious gatherings brought both chaos and opportunity for movement. The charity concert at First Presbyterian Church on the evening of August 17 was attended by virtually every prominent family in Natchez. According to accounts in the Natchez Courier dated August 19, the performance was described as the choir's finest yet. They sang a program of 8 hymns, each performed with what reviewers called transcendent beauty and spiritual depth. The final hymn, Go Down Moses, was noted as particularly moving, with some audience members reportedly moved to tears. What the audience did not realize was that this concert served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. The presence of Natchez's elite in the church meant that enslaved domestic workers throughout the city had unusual freedom of movement that evening, as their owners were all in one location. The concert's timing, ending around 9 p.m., provided enough darkness for initial movement while not being so late as to raise immediate alarm. Most significantly, according to later analysis by Dr. Roberts, the final hymn, Go Down Moses, was not merely emotionally powerful. Encoded in its performance were the final instructions for the escape, the meeting point, the order of departure, and the recognition signal that would identify the guides who were already waiting on the outskirts of town. What happened after the concert has been pieced together from fragmentary sources. According to testimony provided decades later by Elijah Freeman, choir members did not return immediately to their respective plantations. Instead, they made their way to a predetermined meeting point, an abandoned lumber mill 3 miles north of Natchez. There they were joined by the 17 children and 9 elderly relatives who had been secretly prepared for the journey. The group was met by conductors from the Underground Railroad who had been positioned along the route in advance. According to records from the Canadian archives, the escape followed a carefully planned schedule, with the group broken into smaller parties that moved separately to avoid detection, reuniting at designated safe houses along the way. The alarm was not raised until the morning of August 18, when enslaved workers failed to appear for their morning duties. According to the Natchez Courier's coverage, initial reactions ranged from confusion to denial. Many owners initially assumed their workers had simply overslept or were ill. It was not until mid-morning, when it became clear that choir members from multiple households had all vanished simultaneously, that the scale of the disappearance became apparent. The reaction among Natchez's white elite was explosive. According to newspaper accounts, emergency meetings of plantation owners were convened. Posses were organized. Telegraph messages were sent to neighboring counties and states. Rewards totaling over $20,000 were offered for information leading to the recovery of the missing workers. What authorities initially struggled to comprehend was how such a large group could have vanished so completely. Early theories focused on the possibility of a violent uprising or kidnapping by abolitionists. It was not until investigators began examining the timeline more carefully that they realized the escape had been planned far in advance and executed with remarkable precision. Suspicion fell immediately on Elias Howe, who had also vanished on the night of August 17. A search of his cottage revealed that he had taken all personal belongings, leaving no trace of his identity or destination. The revelation that the music teacher had orchestrated the escape caused scandal and outrage throughout Mississippi. According to editorials in the Natchez Courier and other newspapers, the incident represented a profound betrayal of trust and an exposure of dangerous abolitionist infiltration into Southern society. Attempts to track the fugitives proved largely unsuccessful. According to reports filed by sheriffs and slave catchers preserved in county records, the group seemed to have vanished completely. Several false sightings were reported in Louisiana and Arkansas, but none led to recovery of any fugitives. The scale of the escape and the careful planning behind it had created enough confusion that by the time authorities organized an effective pursuit, the fugitives had too great a head start. The legal aftermath of the escape was documented in court cases that dragged on for years. The Natchez Musical Society dissolved in recrimination, with members blaming each other for inadequate vetting of Howe's credentials. Several lawsuits were filed by plantation owners seeking compensation from those who had hired Howe, though most were eventually dismissed. The incident led to passage of new Mississippi laws requiring more stringent documentation for free people of color entering the state and prohibiting the assembly of enslaved workers for musical or educational purposes without direct white supervision. For decades, the fate of the 58 fugitives remained unknown. Newspaper articles and plantation records from the period referred to the incident as the Natchez choir disappearance, and it entered local folklore as a cautionary tale about the dangers of educating enslaved people and trusting outsiders. The first concrete evidence of what happened to the choir emerged in 1889, when a researcher studying Canadian immigration records discovered a notation in the register of a Methodist church in Toronto. The entry, dated November 1847, recorded the arrival of a group of 56 former American slaves who had traveled together from Mississippi. The group included a choir that began performing at the church under the direction of a music teacher named Elijah Freeman. Further research in Canadian archives revealed that the group had settled primarily in Toronto and its surrounding areas. Census records from 1851 and 1861 show many of the individuals establishing themselves as laborers, domestics, and tradespeople. Several members of the original choir continued performing music, and according to church records, they formed the nucleus of what became known as the Freeman Choir, a performance group that gave concerts throughout Ontario for more than 30 years. What happened to Elias Howe, or whoever he truly was, remained mysterious until 1963. That year, Grace Howe Freeman, an 89-year-old woman living in Detroit, contacted journalist Robert Williams after reading about the civil rights movement in Mississippi. She identified herself as the daughter of Thomas and Ruth Freeman, who had been members of the Natchez choir. According to Grace's account, recorded in a series of interviews preserved at Wayne State University, her parents had told her the full story of the escape. The man known as Elias Howe was indeed a fugitive from Virginia who had assumed a false identity. His real name, according to Grace, was Elijah Freeman, and he had escaped from bondage in 1839 after learning music from Quaker missionaries. Most significantly, Grace had preserved a manuscript hymnal that had belonged to Elijah Freeman. This was the document that, when examined by researchers at Howard University, revealed the hidden notation system and confirmed that freedom had indeed been encoded in hymns. Grace also provided photographs of her parents and other members of the original choir, taken in Toronto in the 1870s, showing the survivors in their later years. According to Grace's account, Elijah Freeman remained in Canada until his death in 1872. He continued teaching music and reportedly trained several younger people in his methods, though whether they used these skills for further Underground Railroad activities is unknown. He never revealed his original enslaved name or provided details about his life before 1839, maintaining his created identity until the end. The reunion of documentary evidence with oral testimony allowed researchers to reconstruct the full scope of what Freeman had accomplished. According to analysis by Dr. Marcus Williams published in the Journal of African American History in 1970, the Natchez choir escape represented the largest coordinated flight of enslaved people in Mississippi history and one of the most sophisticated uses of coded communication documented in Underground Railroad activities. What makes the case particularly significant, according to Dr. Williams, was the length of preparation involved. Most escape attempts were necessarily spontaneous or involved small numbers of people. Freeman spent 4 years building trust, training participants, coordinating with Northern allies, and embedding instructions in a form that could be practiced openly. The patience and long-term planning this required was extraordinary. Moreover, Freeman's method demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both African and European musical traditions and how they could be merged in ways that appeared innocuous to white observers while carrying profound meaning to those initiated into the code. According to musicologist Dr. Helena Roberts, the hymnal represents an important artifact in understanding how African cultural knowledge survived and adapted within the constraints of slavery. The Freeman Choir continued performing in Toronto until the 1880s. According to church records and newspaper accounts from Canadian archives, their concerts always included what was described as a hymn in an unknown tongue that the choir sang as a closing number. No written music existed for this hymn, and it was never performed for secular audiences, only in church services. When researchers in the 1960s played recordings of West African ceremonial music to descendants of choir members, several identified the mysterious hymn as similar in structure to Yoruba and Igbo praise songs. According to Grace Howe Freeman, her parents had explained that this final hymn was a song of thanksgiving to ancestors, sung in fragments of languages carried in memory from Africa, preserved through generations of enslavement, and finally sung freely in a land where the singers could not be punished for honoring their heritage. The physical remnants of the story are few. The First Presbyterian Church in Natchez where the final concert was held still stands, now a historic site. A historical marker erected in 2008 acknowledges the building's connection to the choir escape, though it avoids specifying details that might seem to celebrate violation of antebellum law. The warehouse where rehearsals were held was demolished in the 1920s. In Toronto, the cemetery where Elijah Freeman is buried contains a simple stone with the name Elias Freeman and dates 1811 to 1872. Nothing on the marker indicates his extraordinary accomplishments or true identity. Several descendants of the original choir members still live in the Toronto area, though most knew little of their ancestors' history until research in the 1960s began revealing the full story. The manuscript hymnal, the key piece of physical evidence, is preserved in the archives of Howard University, where it has been the subject of extensive musicological and cryptographic analysis. The document represents a unique artifact of resistance, demonstrating how enslaved people used the cultural forms imposed upon them by their oppressors as vehicles for liberation. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of Elijah Freeman's work exists not in documents or artifacts but in the realm of sound and memory. According to interviews conducted by folklorists in the 1970s with descendants of the choir, many families preserved musical traditions that had been passed down through generations. Certain ways of ornamenting hymns, particular rhythmic patterns, specific preferences for how harmonies should be voiced, all these were described as coming from the old people, from those who had sung their way to freedom. Some descendants reported that growing up, they had been taught that music was not just beauty but also power, that songs could carry more than melody, that voices joined together could accomplish what individuals alone could not. Whether these lessons were explicitly connected to the story of the Natchez choir or represented a more diffuse cultural memory, they spoke to the continued resonance of what Freeman had taught. The story of the secret choir has taken on new significance in recent decades as scholars have worked to document the full complexity of resistance to slavery. For too long, according to Dr. Jennifer Wilson, whose 2015 book The Freedom Hymnal examined the case in detail, narratives of slavery emphasized either passive victimization or violent rebellion, missing the countless ways enslaved people worked within and against the system simultaneously, using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. Freeman's method exemplified this complex resistance. He did not reject European music or Christian hymnody as tools of oppression. Instead, he infiltrated them, subverted them, made them speak in two voices simultaneously. He used the slaveholders' own cultural values, their pride in musical refinement, their desire to display their enslaved workers' accomplishments, as cover for an operation that undermined the entire system. In 2018, a group of musicians and historians created a multimedia performance piece called The Freedom Hymnal, which attempted to recreate some of Freeman's coded hymns based on Dr. Roberts's analysis of the manuscript. The piece premiered at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., with a choir composed of descendants of Underground Railroad participants from across North America. According to reviews of the performance, the most powerful moment came when the choir sang, "Go Down Moses," the final hymn from the August 17th concert. The arrangement included both the conventional harmonization that Natchez audiences would have heard and a second version incorporating the hidden notation, the coded rhythms and melodic patterns that had carried instructions for escape. Hearing the two versions in succession made viscerally clear how much had been hidden in plain sound, how freedom had been sung into being under the ears of those who thought themselves masters. The performance ended with a mysterious hymn that the Freeman Choir had sung in Toronto, reconstructed from descriptions preserved in Canadian church records and musical transcriptions made by researchers working with descendants. The words were in a blend of Yoruba, Igbo, and other West African languages, a reconstruction of what might have been sung when voices no longer had to hide their meaning, when a song of thanksgiving could be sung without fear. Whether this reconstruction captured the actual sound of that hymn is unknowable. The original died with the last members of the Freeman Choir in the 1890s, and oral tradition can only preserve so much across generations. But the attempt itself speaks to the enduring power of the story, the sense that something profound was accomplished in those rehearsal rooms in Natchez, something worth remembering and honoring. Today, the story of Elijah Freeman and the Secret Choir appears in histories of the Underground Railroad, in studies of coded communication, in musicological examinations of African American musical traditions, and in educational programs about resistance to slavery. It has inspired novels, documentary films, and numerous academic articles. Yet for all this attention, certain mysteries remain. We do not know Elijah Freeman's birth name or which Virginia plantation he escaped from. We do not know how he learned his remarkable musical skills or who helped him create his false identity. We do not know what happened to the two choir members who apparently did not make it to Canada with the others. We do not know whether Freeman's methods were used in other Underground Railroad operations or whether his system was unique. These gaps in the historical record serve as reminders that for every story we manage to recover from the past, many others remain hidden or lost entirely. The Natchez choir escape only came to light because enough fragments of evidence survived. Newspaper accounts, court records, church registers, oral traditions preserved across generations, and ultimately a manuscript hymnal kept safe for more than a century until it could finally be revealed. On certain summer evenings in Natchez, when the air is heavy with humidity and the Mississippi River flows silently past the old mansions, some locals claim they can hear music drifting on the breeze. The sound of voices singing in perfect harmony, performing hymns in the old style, the way they were sung before recorded music homogenized all regional variations. Whether these sounds are memory, imagination, acoustic anomalies, or something else entirely is impossible to say. But for those who know the story of the secret choir, the phantom music serves as a reminder that songs can carry more than melody, that harmony can hide revolution, that sometimes the most powerful resistance happens not in violence or open confrontation, but in patience, preparation, and the careful accumulation of small acts of defiance, building note by note toward freedom. Elijah Freeman spent 4 years teaching 32 people to sing their way out of bondage. 4 years of rehearsals where every hymn was a map, every melody a message, every harmony a hope deferred but never abandoned. When they finally sang their last concert for an audience that heard beauty but missed meaning entirely, they walked out of that church and kept walking, all the way to freedom. In the end, perhaps that is what makes this story so resonant. It reminds us that liberation often requires both art and strategy, that culture can be weapon as well as solace, and that sometimes the most subversive act is to take what has been given to control you and transform it into the very instrument of your escape. The masters thought they owned the music. But the music belonged to those who truly understood what it could say, who could hear freedom in every note and sing it into reality, measure by measure, until the final hymn ended and the long walk north began.